I'm going to call the meeting to order. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 5.
Welcome to meeting number 134 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information Privacy and Ethics. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3H and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 13th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the impact of disinformation and of misinformation on the work of parliamentarians. I would like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour today. Both are here by video conference.
First of all, Mr. Jacob Suzla, who's a correctional officer federally, and also Mr. Michael Wagner, who is online with us today. He's a professor and William T. Evju Distinguished Chair for the Wisconsin IDEA from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mr. Suzla, you're going to have up to 5 minutes for your opening statement, followed secondly by Mr. Wagner. And I apologize for the delay. We've had some speeches in the House that have precipitated this delay, and so we're going to start now. Go ahead, Mr. Suzla, please.
Thank you. I've been asked here today to speak to my experience with misinformation from the Correctional Service of Canada. I am and have been a correctional officer with the CSC since 2007. This opportunity gives me a chance to address issues I've experienced and observed and are experienced by correctional officers all over the country who are not able to speak or to draw attention to these issues because of fear of retribution and punishment. It is widely known amongst correctional officers that the message of the state of our penitentiaries as represented by the Correctional Service of Canada is a very inaccurate representation of what is happening in our prisons. Violence in our prisons is one of the most pressing issues faced by correctional officers. The levels of violence within a prison is at a level I've never seen in my career. The violence against correctional officers is at a level I never would have assumed it could or would ever be allowed to get to. I classify this as a measure of misinformation because the issue is so discarded by the service. Officers are often ridiculed by management for reporting assaults and are often coerced to not document or to write reports regarding these assaults. Correctional officers understand that working in Canada's federal prisons come with inherent risks, but the injuries they incur are widely discredited through many means, not the least of which is the General Correctional Service of Canada refusal to allow assaults and threats against correctional officers to be documented and reported through occupational health and safety procedures. Incidents that are documented seldom result in any change in routine or procedure that would alter the likelihood of these happening again. Correctional officers struggle against the service while trying to recover from injuries sustained at work. They are pressured to suck it up, to grow up, to not report, and to not miss work after an injury or an incident. It is a general cliche that rings true within prison that someone has to die before a safety concern regarding protection from inmates is actioned. Life-threatening incidents and murders are the generally accepted threshold for taking a situation seriously. But why do I classify this as misinformation? Because a picture is painted by the CSC that does not take this reality into account, and by doing so, further belittles the struggles of those on the front line in prison. Initiatives like the Needle Exchange Program is an easy example of a response to a very inaccurately presented problem within prisons. Canada's prisons are filled with drugs. Correctional officers across the country will unanimously agree that the only change is the amount of narcotics in prison year after year is the increase. Substances that were seldomly seen are now so prevalent that they draw little to no attention when confiscated. Officers have become proficient in administering naloxone to overdosing inmates, sometimes multiple times a shift. Needles within Canada prisons have always been a rare piece of contraband to find. They were generally crudely made and ineffective. Probably for this reason, drugs within prison are very seldom used intravenously. In prison, drugs are smoked or snorted. The introduction of the Prison Needle Exchange Program has and is introducing an injection drug problem that did not exist in our prisons. The service's rhetoric that this is a harm reduction measure is actually creating a new problem that we on the front lines have never had to deal with. Besides the introduction of injecting drugs in prison, we are also presenting weapons to a violent inmate population and creating an economy for these needles to be used and distributed through the populations. The use of medium security inmates outside medium and maximum security inmates unsupervised outside of a perimeter fence, and the terms used to get around policies that would not allow these to happen are standard practice. Terms like perimeter work clearance and on-site TAs, or temporary absences, or positions of trust are terms often used at sites for inmates who are not eligible for forms of release into the community or away from security measures. Inmates in these positions often introduce contraband into the institution, most commonly in the forms of drugs and cell phones. Memos are often written directing officers to not perform regular search procedures on these inmates once they return to the institution because of their positions of trust or exempt status. Inmates on perimeter exception are constantly using these opportunities to visit community restaurants, coffee shops like Starbucks, etc., and of course to introduce contraband and participate in other security compromising activities, including escapes. It is demoralizing and insulting to frontline correctional officers to see the organization they work for misrepresent their workplace and the dangers they face, and further contribute to those dangers by not properly responding to issues, fostering a culture that does not allow accurate reporting, and minimizing the physical and mental injuries often incurred in this environment. That's my opening statement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Suzla. I'm going to go to Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm happy to offer some general thoughts about misinformation and misinformation correction before answering your questions to the best of my knowledge and experience. My name is Michael W. Wagner. I have a PhD in political science from Indiana University. I'm the William T. Evu Distinguished Chair for the Wisconsin Idea and a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication, where I direct the Center for Communication and Civic Renewal at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's well established that Russia's Internet Research Agency, or IRA, operated thousands of Twitter accounts posing as individuals to weigh in on U.S. and Canadian political discussions on social media, both in the United States and other countries, including Canada. Beyond driving some social media conversations witnessed by and engaged with by users of social media platforms like Twitter, now called X, these IRA accounts also found their way into legitimate news coverage, being quoted as examples of the person on the street, further amplifying IRA messages about issues like Russia's support for Russia's war with Ukraine. This greatly amplifies the reach of their messages as far as more people consume legitimate news sources than use social media to learn about and discuss politics. It also increases the likelihood that lawmakers could be affected by IRA posts, as research also demonstrates that parliamentarians use legitimate news sources as a way to read public opinion, something lawmakers can then choose to use in their own decision-making calculus about how to represent their constituents. In terms of another aspect of misinformation online, it's useful to think about what factors are most associated with inaccurate content going viral, that is, being spread widely and quickly. Posts with more emotional resonance are more likely to get shared online. Posts published at times people are habitually more likely to be on social media matters to make things go viral as well. Perhaps most importantly, key influencers in politics and the news media sharing or spreading that information are often critical amplifiers to virality. In terms of misinformation correction, fact checks can work to help people come to believe things that are verifiably true. Labeling stories as a fact check tends to motivate audiences to think about the accuracy of information while they're consuming it. People who are willing to admit what they don't know are also more likely to benefit from fact checks. But fact checks come at a cost, the cost of people believing the fact checkers are biased, which could affect long-term trusting relationships the audience has with more legitimate news sources. Another promising strategy to correct misinformation on social media is the use of a strategy called observed correction. Rather than engaging with the person making a mis or disinformation claim, simply correcting the claim without focusing on the person and linking to the accurate information is useful. Research shows that observational correction occurs when seeing misinformation shared by others being debunked on social media. It reduces misperceptions or beliefs in misinformation among the audiences witnessing the exchange, even if it doesn't affect the opinion of the person who created the false post to begin with. The strategy is shown to be more effective in some circumstances than pre-bunking misinformation, and there's some evidence that logic-based interventions perform better than fact-based interventions as well. I'm happy to answer questions about these factors or other factors related to misinformation and the health of democracies. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you both for being under time. That'll allow for more questions. We're going to start, we have 6-minute rounds starting with each party. I'm going to begin with Mr. Caputo. Mr. Caputo, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Professor Wagner, for being here. I appreciate that. Thank you as well, Mr. Susley, for being here. There's no disrespect meant to you, Professor Wagner, but I am going to focus my questions to the other witness. That's not to deny your qualifications or insight in any way, shape, or form. Now, Mr. Susley, just to be clear here, you're representing yourself. You're not representing your union or anything like that. That's correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to run a few scenarios by you, but before we do that, what I'd like to delve into is the culture of the Correctional Service of Canada. Now, the Correctional Service of Canada reports to parliamentarians through the Minister of Justice and is accountable. In fact, we have the Commissioner appear at committee. So when we're talking about misinformation and disinformation, particularly as it relates to parliamentarians, in my view, this is actually quite germane. Would you say that CSE has what I would call, these are my words, a culture of secrecy? What would you say about that?
I think that would be a fair statement to make.
And can you elaborate on what you've seen generally? We don't want you to breach any confidentiality or anything like that. But the culture of secrecy, how does that manifest itself? What are the consequences?
My experience has been that the service is inclined to answer the questions to the bare minimum, to not expose themselves to anything that would portray them in a way that is counter to how they want to be looked at by parliamentarians and by the public.
How do they want to be looked at, in your view, by parliamentarians and the public?
In my view, they want to be regarded as progressive, as I think they would very much prefer, to be honest, to be left out of most any spotlight they can, but certainly to be viewed as a progressive organization that is on the forefront of changing the perception of corrections.
How does CSE deal with anything negative?
In my experience, they don't, or by quickly clamping down on those who are drawing attention to any negativity.
So in those situations, if we as Parliament are trying to evaluate how well our correctional system is operating, I mean, this is just a comment, it seems like we don't get the unvarnished truth. Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on this specific scenario, but I did some work, and I believe I produced a video on it, wherein the Correctional Service of Canada put out a press release after somebody escaped. And the escape said the person escaped from institutional property. The person was on medium security. For those who don't know, that's 2 very large fences surrounding the institution, the same as maximum, in fact. Very difficult to escape from. And the service put out a bulletin saying he escaped from the grounds of medium security. Sounds fine, right? But the information I had was that this person was actually allowed to be outside the fence. That was a pretty material omission, in my view. If you're going to say someone escaped from medium security, I picture them jumping over 2 razor wire fences that are about 20 feet apart and are about 12 feet high. That's a pretty material omission, kind of like we sometimes see in Parliament, tell half the truth, and that's true. He was on the grounds. Can you comment not specifically on this case, but whether this type of thing is a surprise given your experience?
In my experience, that is absolutely no surprise. Those are more common than I think most people would ever believe.
And would, in that case, this service be trying to, I'm just inferring, that doesn't want to say this person was actually outside of the fence? You don't have to answer that. I'm just saying. It just seems they don't want to acknowledge this person was outside of the perimeter fence and they simply walked away. And yet we as parliamentarians and the public get the half-truth. I also exposed Paul Bernardo and his situation. And I said to the public, and I said very clearly, I came eye to eye with that offender. And CSC came out and were quoted that I had no interactions with that inmate. And yet I hadn't said I had any interactions, but they framed it as though I was lying about it. Does that type of reaction from CSC surprise you, given your experience?
Based on my experience, that doesn't surprise me at all.
Now, needle exchange. Jail has an underground economy, is that correct?
Yes.
Value, right? Drugs, weapons, any information, cell phones, everything has value. Is that right?
That's correct. It's we phrase it. That's what makes jail go round. Is that underground economy?
Monsieur le Président.
I have just. Oh,
Point d'ordre.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Pardon, Monsieur le Président. J'ai un peu de...
Apologies. I don't see the link to disinformation for parliamentarians here. This seems to be completely off topic. Thank you for your comment, Mr. Villemur. The study is on disinformation and misinformation and the impact on parliamentarians. I believe that Mr. Caputo will bring his questions back to our study.
Go ahead, please.
Candidly, that we're talking about how a government agency communicates with the public and parliamentarians. I don't know what could be more germane to misinformation and disinformation. So I will move forward. The government has spoken with parliamentarians and the public about needle exchanges. What kind of picture have they painted about needle exchanges? And I've got about 10, 20, if you can answer that in about 15 seconds, please.
That it's a harm reduction measure.
What kind of danger are you seeing, and is that being communicated to parliamentarians?
I don't believe that's being accurately communicated at all. The dangers we're seeing is the introduction of weapons into the facilities and the feeding of this underground economy, where we're creating elements to the economy that we haven't dealt with before.
Fear retribution.
Mr. Caputo, we're out of time on this round. Ms. Khalid, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. Professor Wagner, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Perhaps I'm sure you've been studying this for the past couple of years now, and it's been a while where the Conservative Party leader has been attacking mainstream media and journalists with the intention to mislead and make Canadians believe that the news networks they have trusted before for many, many years are no longer trustworthy. Can you perhaps comment on the dangers that this presents to the state of Canada's information ecosystem and to our democracy?
Sure. There's a long line of research in the study of political communication that what researchers call blaming the referees is a strategy often that political elites can use to try to diminish trust in verifiably accurate news sources. And so there's a distinction to be made between news sources that have things like corrections policies and punish journalists when they get facts wrong versus other organizations that also sometimes frame themselves as being news organizations but are primarily opinion organizations. And so when it comes to the more trusted places, the places where they're engaging in what we would think of as more legitimate journalism, which doesn't mean they're always right, but means that they correct themselves when they are wrong. It's a danger to diminish trust in those organizations without evidence. And a lot of times a strategy that political elites use is to try and diminish the amount of trust in mainstream news sources. And the purpose of that diminishing trust is then to not face consequences from voters at the ballot box, as an example, for behaviors lawmakers or others may engage in.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I will tack on the second half of that question to my next question. Now, inflammatory language and material, you spoke about this in your opening remarks as well with respect to emotions getting more engagement than facts. And we've seen dog whistles, et cetera, by political parties generating a lot of engagement. And that engagement does lead to ad revenue as well. So, is it fair to say that media platforms are actually benefiting financially when and if they allow this dissemination of mis and disinformation on their platforms?
I think it's fair to say that social media platforms benefit from that, and that some news media platforms benefit from that as well. It partially depends upon the major purpose of the platform and why people use it. And so if it's a place where people are trying to learn what's true, there might not be as much of a financial benefit as for those who might seek out a news source because that source tells them that they are right and the other side is wrong. And so there are advantages to following that kind of model, but not for all media in a blanket way.
I appreciate that. And I'll go back to my original question partly. Say, is there any correlation between a person's distrust of mainstream media sources and their participation in the democratic process? And if so, how?
There is in some ways. And so people who distrust mainstream sources tend to be more supportive of political violence as an avenue to exact political preferences. Many people who are distrustful of mainstream news sources are also highly participatory. And in fact, many people who believe in conspiracy theories are extraordinarily knowledgeable and have very low trust in political institutions like mainstream news media sources or elements of government. And so there are lots of different ways that one's distrust of news could foster participation, sometimes encouraging more violence, but often encouraging more participation in voting, political donations, posting online, things like that.
I appreciate that. Now, I understand, you spoke about this, about the role that the Western social media platforms play. Do you think that there is an obligation on these social media platforms with respect to the algorithms and how information is disseminated, whether it is truthful information or it's misinformation, disinformation, hate speech? Do you think that social media companies have a responsibility to control how those algorithms are impacting what an individual Canadian is seeing within their feed and how it's impacting their participation in the democratic process?
I think that there are responsibilities that social media platforms have when it comes to the unfettered amplification of things that are known to be false. Those can often be very dangerous and have violent consequences or other consequences that might be political consequences but are related to believing in things that are verifiably not true. Much of politics operates in a gray area where some things that are said are true and some things are not. And so it can be dangerous for social media platforms to regulate with too heavy of a hand and stifle speech. But when it comes to de-amplifying statements that are known to be verifiably false, social media platforms have an obligation to, in my view, to not try to share that information widely with their users.
Now, you spoke a little bit about fact-checking as a method of controlling misinformation, disinformation, and how it's disseminated. And you also talked about the bias as to who exactly is fact-checking. Now, I've seen, a lot of people, some people, if they're sold on an idea, you Google something, you'll find 20 articles countering your idea. All you need to do is to find that one article to confirm what your belief
Mr. Lead,
is.
if you can just quick...
Absolutely. How do you think that plays into what kind of regulations and partnerships governments need to have with social media companies in that dissemination of information?
I need a very quick response, please.
That's a very difficult question to answer because it's very difficult to figure out the volume there. And so it's something that platforms need to discuss with regulators, but I don't have a quick answer to that question, I'm sorry to say.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering that if the witness can perhaps think about it and give a written response to that question.
I'll deal with that at the end of the meeting like we typically do with those requests. On va commencer avec...
We're going to move on to Monsieur Villemur for 6 minutes. For the witnesses...
The French translation, please, Monsieur Villemur. Commencez pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us. It was a pleasure to hear from you, and it was very interesting. I'll start with Mr. Wagner. Social media, in general, are they cautious of disinformation, or do they simply say that they are? As my colleague mentioned earlier, there's revenue associated with clicks. So is it a surface level awareness?
At first, I think that they is a term. Like social media platforms operate really differently, but in general, social media platforms vary in how aggressive they are at de-amplifying false claims, amplifying other kinds of claims. As an example, in the United States, in 2016, a high percentage of things that were not true were exposed to people over Facebook. Facebook was then deeply criticized for that, and in 2020, that percentage dropped precipitously because Facebook engaged in more aggressive diminishment of inauthentic behavior on their platform. And when the criticism died down, they stopped doing that, and that percentage is increasing again. And so they're not static in how they engage in these kinds of behaviors. And it often is in response to criticism and perceptions of potential regulation.
Ben, ça vous avez mentionné un peu plus tôt.
You mentioned earlier that frivolous things might generate more clicks than something more serious. Considering that social media is used less for information and more for enjoying oneself, how can somebody share a serious message when people are mostly using social media for entertainment?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with the audience individual social media users cultivate. And so most people, I think, cultivate audiences around their interests related to entertainment in some sort of way, or sports or those kinds of things. But others cultivate audiences based upon commenting on public affairs, sharing evidence about politics, or trying to organize and persuade people, or to sow chaos into the social media ecosphere. And so I think it really depends upon what the purpose is to answer that question.
Vous savez que Twitter a un problème au Brésil.
Twitter recently had a problem in Brazil. They were banned and are now back. Did Twitter change anything so that they could operate in Brazil?
I'm not directly aware of changes that Twitter made with respect to what happened to them in Brazil. I can say that in general, they often alter their behaviors in response to governments regulating or fining them.
Donc, comme vous l'affirmiez un peu plus tôt,
As you stated earlier, you shed a light on an issue, they'll work on it while the light is still shining, and then they'll go back to their previous behavior, correct?
That at least happened with Facebook, and we know to some degree that that's happened after the ownership change of Twitter and then the renaming of Twitter to X. There's been a difference in the content moderation behaviors of that platform since then.
pourriez-vous élaborer sur la modération du contenu de X?
Can you talk about the different content moderation of X?
There is far less content moderation. Most of the staff that were doing that were either fired or quit after Twitter was taken over by Mr. Musk. And so part of it is that, but there also still, it's not that there isn't any, there's a feature, I think now it's called community notes, that will sometimes append a post. But usually the thing that has to happen to get to that feature being enacted is that multiple sides of a political debate have to agree that the claim is false. And so if one side is pushing a false claim, that's not usually enough to invoke the community notes feature.
Est-ce que, en matière de désinformation,
Regarding disinformation, if you had to single out the worst platform, which one would it be?
That's a really hard question. I think probably Truth Social would be, I think, the single worst. There's there's kind of unfettered access to saying things that aren't true, and very little behavior from the platform that lets the audience know that claims being shared widely are not true.
Si je vais exclure pour le moment Truth Social
Let's take Truth Social out of the equation because that's certain users and not most of the population. Could you identify a platform other than Truth Social?
qui pourrait-on
Who could we identify other than Truth Social as being kind of the worst for disinformation?
It's hard to say with accuracy because we don't know the denominator of how many posts are made on all of the different platforms as compared to how many things aren't true. My impression is that X has now become that leader, but I don't know that as an empirical fact.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Wagner.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. Thank you, Mr. Villemur.
6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wagner, can you please state your subject matter expertise on this one more time for the record?
Sure. I have a PhD in political science, and I conduct research on individual engagement in information ecologies, and including news, social media, and individual conversation, and look at outcomes related to what people believe to be true, what they want from their government, and how they participate civically and politically.
Mr. Suzeli, can you please state your subject matter expertise on misinformation and disinformation?
I'll state my experience as a correctional officer since 2007 within the federal penitentiary system.
So no subject matter expertise on misinformation. Okay. Mr. Wagner, with that being said, who are the primary actors spreading misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation? And I know you're coming from an American context, but perhaps you might have some insight into the Canadian political system.
A lot of mis and disinformation that is shared in Western democracies originates from Russian sources in the IRA, Internet Research Agency, and other bot farms in different parts of Europe that exist to kind of sow false claims and try and spread them. In the American context, a key spreader of misinformation that also gets a lot of attention is the former president, Donald Trump, as in terms of an account that spreads a lot of misinformation. But I would say, the primary organization that is really attempting to influence elections in Canada, in the United States, is the Russian IRA.
And are certain parliamentarians more at risk than others in being targeted and affected by disinformation campaigns?
It seems to be that the IRA or the Russian government has candidates they would prefer to see win elections and candidates they would prefer to see lose elections, and so those they would prefer to see lose tend to be more in the to have a greater likelihood of being targeted with negative information. Although sometimes candidates in different parties get positive and negative information from these agencies as an effort to just sow chaos and be confusing, which is often one of the objectives of this kind of organization.
Is it fair to say that this goes well beyond Russia? Because, I would put to you that it's been my experience, we love to oversimplify this as Russian, Chinese, maybe Indian sometimes. But is it not fair to say that there are various state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are used to spread this? And, I would reference Operation Earnest Voice, and, in the United States of America. I would reference, you talked about Donald Trump. Obviously, the United States was a prime propagator of the Chinese virus during COVID and a lot of vaccine misinformation, disinformation. There are allies such as so-called allies such as Israel with the Hasbara. They have a whole ministry of strategic affairs that deals with targeting political actors. And I know that that's kind of come out in the United States. So can you maybe just take a step back and zoom back and talk a little bit more beyond Russia in terms of the state-sponsored internet propaganda machines that are out there?
There are lots of state-sponsored efforts to try and influence elections in other countries and in their own countries. There are lots of non-state sponsored organizations that also are trying to do the same and do so by trying to spread mis and disinformation. So yeah, it's certainly not any one actor. If asked to name the primary one, I would say Russia, as I was asked earlier. But in general, there are lots of there are as many opportunities as there are users of the internet in some respects.
What advice would you have, if any, on us dealing with attempts or times or scenarios that become prevalent when our so-called allies are actively engaged in presenting misinformation and disinformation? Do you view it as a national security threat when foreign state actors are actively engaged in spreading disinformation and misinformation?
That's outside my area of expertise, but I, as a citizen, worry about how state-sponsored mis and disinformation from or toward allies or adversaries. I think I worry about all of it, and so it's certainly something that, in my view, governments should be talking with each other about, and also parliamentarians should be talking with their constituents about.
In terms of a risk assessment in national security, how high would you put misinformation and disinformation as being a threat to free and fair elections when it comes to Western democracies?
Much higher than it used to be, at least in the United States context. Mis and disinformation on social media platforms has been tied to encouraging the January 6th atrocities at the United States Capitol as an example of how mis and disinformation about the results of an election can foment political violence. There's also a high number of mis and disinformation behaviors that occur around elections, trying to target particular populations, telling them the wrong day for an election, or telling them rules about what they have to do when they vote that aren't accurate, and those sorts of things. And so those are all dangers to free and fair elections.
Mr. Chair, how much time do I have left?
You're out of time, Mr. Green.
Okay.
Sorry.
We'll catch you on the next round.
So that concludes our first round. We are going to have 2 5-minute rounds and a 2.5-minute round, and that'll conclude our first panel. We want to try to keep it on time here. I'm going to go back to Mr. Caputo for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Susley, before I begin, this idea of expertise is an interesting one because sometimes we have, and people can chuckle, but sometimes we have okay, I apologize. I thought that it was a tuckle to my question. People can have different views on expertise, but in my view, 17 years of real-world expertise or real-world knowledge is highly beneficial to this committee. So I thank you for being here. Sir, do you fear any repercussions for what you are saying to this committee here?
I do.
Do you feel fear, I should say?
Yeah, I anticipate some kind of punitive response to this.
Would you be prepared to let this committee know if there is any sort of response or follow from your testimony here today, given that you were invited by parliamentarians and are simply answering questions from parliamentarians truthfully?
I have no concern with doing that.
I'm going to ask you about gangs in jail and how it's communicated to the public and parliamentarians by the CSC and what's really happening. Do you have any comment on gangs in jail and how that's being communicated and what's really going on?
The CSC prides themselves in having successfully eliminated gangs out of Canadian prisons a number of years ago. I believe it was 2014, 2015. That is a celebrated accomplishment amongst the brass of the CSC, which was accomplished by changing the name of gangs to security threat groups.
Like, what does that mean? Security threat groups? Was it simply just a change in the name, and therefore we say no gangs exist? Do I have that right?
Yes, it was a name change that out of one side of the mouth eliminated gangs, and on the other hand created a very new problem with a very newly named group.
Somebody was to testify before Parliament and say, gangs are not an issue, but we didn't know this, and we have to say security threat groups are. That's certainly misleading in my view. I want you to talk as well about we are told that in corrections there's safe, secure, humane control, and people are transferred in consistent, when I say transfer down security from maximum to medium to minimum, in accordance with their risk to public safety and things like that. Do you have any comment on that, sir?
That's a very hot issue amongst correctional officers about what we perceive and believe is the inaccurate security classification of inmates being inappropriately downgraded or downgraded through security levels without the outside of where that inmate is fit to be operating in. When we have a maximum security inmate positioned into a medium or minimum security environment, of course, that produces all kinds of threats to us and to the public.
And is the public, is this type of thing routinely communicated to parliamentarians and the public?
It's very rarely communicated to anyone internally. I would be shocked if it was communicated externally at all. It's usually done through the form of what's called overrides.
Overrides, okay. What's an override is when a manager essentially says, I disagree with what the computer has spit out and I'm going to change that on my own. That's a kind of crude way of putting it. Is that accurate?
Essentially.
How much time do I have, Mr. Chair, please?
A minute and 10 seconds.
Okay, in a minute and 10 seconds, when somebody's incarcerated, there's a perception that this person is especially in medium and maximum, but people perceive minimum, which has no fences, that people are behind fences. Are there times where people have work clearances or unofficially are escorted out of jails in your experience, contrary to policy, and is that ever communicated?
Absolutely, that happens on an extremely, I would suggest, daily basis in most institutions across the country.
You describe, without breaching any confidentiality or anything like that, describe a scenario that is common knowledge to somebody in your industry?
We have inmates serving life sentences who are not eligible for any forms of parole, but are given fence clearance to work off-site and not out of perimeter during the business day.
Communicated to the public or parliamentarians in annual reports or anything like that?
No, not communicated anywhere.
I assume that's my time, Mr. Chair.
It's close to it. Thank you, Mr. Caputo. Ms. Shanahan for 5. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the witnesses for being here today. Professor Wagner, I find it very interesting, the remarks that you've made, and the fact that you have been you have been undertaking research in this area, which, we must admit is fairly new. So I know that you have you've co-written and published a paper in July 2024 entitled Slant, Extremity, and Diversity, How the Shape of News Use Explains Electoral Judgments and Confidence. And it introduces measures that captures individuals' partisan slant, partisan extremity, and overall diversity of news media used to understand how people interact with contemporary news ecology. Now, one of the conclusions, and I don't pretend to have read this paper, but our analysts have, and I thank them for this question. One of the conclusions in this paper is that a diverse news consumption style can moderate misinformation beliefs. Now, what do you mean by that? What is a diverse news consumption style?
So thank you for the question. A diverse news consumption style is using a wide range of sources, oftentimes some of which will include sources that tend to favor a political ideology other than that of the individual of interest. And so that would be, a liberal who also gets some news from conservative outlets, a conservative who also gets some news from liberal outlets, but also, engages in a higher number of sources to learn from rather than a smaller number. So both the volume and the diversity, and then the slant, the direction of the information from a political perspective.
Okay, so when you mean diversity, it's actually in points of view, because I was wondering if it actually had to do with types of media, just knowing that watching television news, for example, very different experience from looking at Facebook news. Would that's a diversity that's important?
So in that particular paper, we don't use social media because that social media aren't news sources. They don't produce news in the way that a journalist does. They share news, and a lot of what gets shared on social media are links to news. But in that particular paper, it's looking at news sources, print, broadcast, digital, radio, those kinds of sources. And there's some evidence that different sources have different, like broadcast news, broadcast television tends to help those with less education learn more about politics, whereas newspapers tend to help, and digital news tends to help folks with more education learn about politics. So there are some differences in how people benefit from the different sources they might consume.
Professor, help me out here because so when we think about different news sources and that they would have different points of view, you know, I consider myself a well-read person. I consume a lot of news, and you know, I would think that I don't know, CNN is considered liberal. Washington Post, I don't know. CTV, I would have considered conservative, but now apparently it's liberal. Like, how do we identify, or is that even useful to be identifying different news sources that way?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, and any way that anyone, including myself, makes those labels is open to criticism. So one strategy is to use what we did in that paper, which is a set of scores called the Ferris scores that array news sources based upon the ideological orientation of their users. And so that is one way to measure how liberal or conservative or centrist a source might be. Another would be to compare the kinds of sources that news organizations quote with the kind of sources that lawmakers of different political parties quote, and look for correspondence between those. And so if a newspaper quoted sources that more liberal parliamentarians refer to in speeches, that might be an example of that paper being more liberal, and another, you know, and vice versa. But all of these, of course, have their problems. None of them are infallible.
Recommendation before my time is over on what you would consider the most well-balanced news sources or credible news sources?
I would say often sources that are public sponsored. So the United States, like National Public Radio and public television, as an example, the BBC as another. These are often high quality news sources. It's also the case, though, you know, that any government sponsored source does run the danger of bias that might favor the government since they are signing the checks.
Okay.
At your next study.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. Monsieur Villemure, pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
For 2.5 minutes, you have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wagner, I'll come back to you. We've gotten used to living with things that are false or untrue. And there are people who create news. Is it too late to counter disinformation?
I don't think it's too late. I think there are among the fastest growing legitimate news sources in the West are fact-checking news organizations. So there is an audience for reporting that does more than just say, here's what our leaders said, but says, were these things verifiably accurate, and how do we know that or not? And so I don't think it's too late, but it's definitely an uphill battle.
D'accord.
To your knowledge, do you believe that Canadian legislation is strong enough to counter disinformation?
I am sadly not enough of an area expert to speak to that. I wish I could, but that's not my area of expertise.
Alors, est-ce que vous auriez une...
Would you have a recommendation on what it would be important to act on as quickly as possible?
I think information that's time dependent. And so, you know, when there is a natural disaster and there's dis or misinformation about government response to it, when there is an election where the time to vote ends at a certain time and there's mis or disinformation floating around, I think things with a time deadline, I think, are probably the most important to engage in action about.
De votre point de vue de scientifique.
As a political scientist, is it strange that we here talk about lies every day, and that we simply accept that people brazenly lie with no consequences? Does that have an impact on democracy?
I think that it does. Most folks don't know very much about what's going on in their country and around the world. And most people don't wake up and ask themselves, how do they hold their government accountable today? What instead, they rely upon legitimate sources of information to create penalties for lying, penalties such as not being reelected, censure or sanction from their colleagues, a public embarrassment for things that they say that are not true. And we see a decrease in many Western countries with respect to those kinds of behaviors, both from lawmakers and from news organizations in some respects over time. And we see as societies polarize and divide, we see an increasing willingness of people to forgive the sins of their side and focus on the sins of the other side.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur Villemure. Mr. Green, 2.5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to be able to explore some of those concepts, perhaps in English, for the good and welfare of the people that are watching, because we have had several witnesses appear before this committee in the context of the study to talk about misinformation and disinformation and how it can negatively impact Canadians' trust in public institutions. So the current information ecosystem has been seeing an erosion in trust that some people have as well in traditional media. And obviously the same impacts are happening in the States. So have you done research on the impact of misinformation and disinformation on public trust in institutions and traditional media?
Yes, but not in Canada.
What are the main takeaways from the American example that we might be able to learn from?
One is that when ideological sources attack the referees, which is to say attack legitimate news sources time and time again, and then want to rely upon those sources to fact check things that they care about, they learn quickly that their audience no longer trusts them. And so we've seen very prominent people who've engaged in kind of polarized communication on talk radio and cable television in the United States so distrust in legitimate news sources. And then when a candidate came along of their own party that they didn't like, and they told their audience, we can't trust this person because they lie all the time, their audience said, but you told us not to trust these sources. And so when there are no referees, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of a game or integrity of politics.
In terms of ideological ecosystems, we know that in that continuum, it ends in a place of ideologically motivated violent extremism. We know that in the States, or at least it's been reported, and I'll leave it to you to comment as a subject matter expert, that the 2 attempts on Donald Trump's life were in fact from ideologically motivated right-wing extremists. Is that not correct?
I'm confident that at least one of those is correct, and I believe that the most recent reporting I've seen is consistent with your characterization.
And so in that space, you quite rightly identify that when this ecosystem of violence, political violence, is unleashed in a world that is absent of fact and completely disassociated from basic civil norms, political violence will impact everybody. Is that a safe assumption to make?
It certainly could. And it's the case that individuals feel it in survey research that we do when we ask those who don't participate in politics why they don't. A non-trivial percentage say it's because there are too many dangerous people out there who, are often believing some of the things that you're talking about with respect to things that aren't true that can often lead to political violence.
Okay.
So in short, that undermines democracy at its foundation if people don't even want to engage because they're afraid of ideologically violent people.
You can't have a free and fair election if everyone doesn't feel safe to participate.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Wagner. I want to thank you and Mr. Suzla for being here today. That concludes our first panel. And going back to what Ms. Khalid had said earlier, I invite both of you to submit to the committee in writing any other thoughts that you may have, because oftentimes you'll walk away and you'll think, I should have said that, should have. So I invite you to do that through the clerk who contacted you to be part of this meeting today. And I would ask if you're going to do that, Friday by 5 o'clock would be a good time to set as a deadline, okay? So I'm going to suspend for a couple minutes before we move to our next panel. The meeting is suspended. I'd like to welcome our witnesses. First, we have Samantha Bradshaw, who's an assistant professor, new technology and security. She's here by video conference, and from the Toronto Metropolitan University, Kareem Bardizi, who is the executive director, as well as Mr. McAndrews, who is here today. I want to welcome you all to the committee.
Mr. McAndrews is
Oh, sorry, Mr. McAndrews is not here. My apologies. I see that on the screen. So, Kareem, welcome, and Samantha, welcome. Ms. Bradshaw, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, please.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Samantha Bradshaw. I'm an assistant professor in new technology and security at American University, where I also direct the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology. And for the past 8 years, my research has examined questions around how state actors co-opt and weaponize social media for achieving political goals. Some of this research has focused on Russian interference, and so I'll spend most of my time discussing this work here today. There's really no doubt that emerging and digital technologies have expanded the scope, the scale, the reach, the precision of disinformation campaigns, and state actors like Russia have learned to use these technologies to reach across their borders and influence individuals in ways that can undermine democracy and the expression of human rights. Since 2017, platforms have been taking down multiple campaigns. In the hundreds now, we've seen state-backed disinformation campaigns being removed by Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and these activities have also been documented across other kinds of platforms, chat applications like WhatsApp, or alternative platforms like Parler. Disinformation and propaganda on these platforms, of course, are used to influence online audiences in ways that advance Russia's geopolitical ambitions. Sometimes they rely on more covert tactics, such as the use of fake social media accounts, bots, online troll farms to spread false information or other harmful narratives discreetly. And other times they rely on more overt propaganda strategies that come from state-sponsored media outlets like RT and Sputnik, which openly disseminate pro-Kremlin narratives. Many of the strategies, too, that we see today really reflect this longer history of Cold War strategies where Soviet leadership undertook many efforts to alter audience attitudes, opinions, and perspectives on events and issues around the world. Back in the day, in addition to promoting overt and attributable content on social media, Soviet entities also employed news agencies, sympathetic newspapers abroad, and courted journalists as sources to spread unattributable messages. And today we're seeing a lot of these strategies also play out in the development of fake websites and fake journalist personas, the development of front media organizations, and the co-option of social media influencers. Some of my more recent work looking at Russian state-backed media coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests in the U.S. over the summer of 2020 investigated elements of this Russian-affiliated media landscape and its digital presence. And we found that a lot of the front media organizations often developed and tailored content to different segments of English-speaking users. A lot of this content was really about playing both sides and emphasizing the racial divides in American politics, with some outlets expressing support for the Black Lives Matter protesters and others emphasizing support for the police and the Blue Lives Matter movement. By tracking a lot of the ownership of the media companies, the movement of staff and journalists that were affiliated with known Russian news agencies, we found lots of connections in the incorporation, the funding, and the personnel who are working for media outlets that claim to be independent from the Russian government. And while things like editorial independence can, of course, be subjective, funding and ownership relations are key criteria in any evaluation process. A lot of the strategies around state media, influencers, front organizations, they've appeared in information operations in other countries around the globe. This includes, as far away as Africa and across the Sahel states, where I've also worked on platform data investigating Russian activities here. And in these examples, we see the co-option of local influencers who are often paid by Russian actors to generate this veneer of legitimacy around the content that is being produced and amplified on social media. So while the specific goals of any influence operation will vary, many are really designed with this intent to disrupt the social fabric of society. In the context of the Sahel, Russian disinformation campaigns often highlighted anti-Western, anti-colonial narratives that really fed into this localized and generational memory to amplify divides within and across society. And this really brings me to my final point that I want to make in my opening remarks about contemporary Russian information operations, and that's that many don't really rely on what we consider traditionally to be disinformation. A lot of the more effective campaigns that we see don't rely on this sense of false information, things that can be easily fact-checked, but rely on identity-based disinformation and tropes around racism, sexism, xenophobia, or even who we are as political citizens. And these tropes are really used then to polarize, to suppress, and to undermine our institutions of democracy.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. The toughest part of my job is having to cut somebody off when they're on a roll, and you were on a roll. So,
honestly, it was right at the end.
Okay, so. Wonderful. It was an abrupt ending. Mr. Bardizzi, you're up for 5 minutes, sir. Go ahead, address the committee.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and for doing this important work. I'm Kareem Bardizzi. I'm the Executive Director of the DAIS, a policy and leadership think tank at Toronto Metropolitan University, working on the bold ideas and better leaders Canada needs for more shared prosperity and shared citizenship. We work in areas of economic, education, and democracy policy. I'll be drawing on my remarks from two studies we've done recently, one supported by the Privy Council Office's Democratic Institutions Secretariat as part of our annual Democracy Exchange Summit, and another one supported by the Department of Canadian Heritage's Digital Citizen Initiative, the Survey of Online Harms. 3 points. First, the state of the threat of foreign or external misinformation and disinformation, it's real, it's ever-changing, and it points, as Professor Bradshaw said, at specific communities triggering specific identities. Canada's National Cyber Threat Assessment has described online foreign influence activities as a new normal. And some of this is difficult to detect. For instance, disinfo and misinfo and private messaging platforms are more likely to reach specific cultural communities or specific identity groups, and they're harder by their very nature to study. And the design of these platforms also makes it more difficult to for the users who are concerned that there may be misinfo or disinfo on those platforms to be flagged for content concern. There's also a number of new vectors, and some have only come to the public attention through judicial actions in other countries. Professor Bradshaw mentioned Russian disinfo, and so you're probably aware that the U.S. Justice Department recently charged 2 employees of RT, a Russian state-controlled media outlet, not for their own content, but in a $10 million US dollar scheme to create and distribute content with hidden Russian government messaging. Some of these payments, as you're probably aware, went to prominent Canadian YouTubers. But the extent of this deception was only revealed thanks to the discovery that accompanies criminal proceedings. Prominent online actors can also play an important role in spreading foreign misinfo and disinfo. And a recent study by Reset Tech shows that Elon Musk's personal engagement with content can amplify 250 or more fold the audience that a piece of foreign misinfo or disinfo receives out in the real world. Another new vector are deepfakes, again, with some of the old techniques, but now fueled by powerful AI algorithms that are available to many at low or no cost. Our recent study of online harm showed that 60% of Canadian residents say they have seen a deepfake online, with 23% reporting seeing deepfakes more than a couple times a week. And that kind of exposure to deepfakes is correlated with the use of social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, X, TikTok, as well as ChatGPT. Second, how to respond to this threat. So it's real and it's coming in multiple forms, and those forms are constantly evolving. On this, our report has a number of recommendations for policymakers, civil society, and individual citizens, and I'll be sure to be tabling that report with you. Recommendations for policymakers and institutions, policy recommendations for civil society, and recommendations for individual citizens. Although I will caution this group, your committee, around expecting too much on behalf of citizens to equip them. They need to indeed be equipped with media and digital literacy skills, but the power of these platforms and their ubiquity really require a policy response. At the dais, we joined dozens of other civil society and research organizations to urge timely passage of Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act. Although misinfo and disinfo isn't an explicitly prescribed harm under the Act, misinfo and disinfo helps fuel the harms that are identified in the Act. And so we would urge timely passage of that. Third, I'd like to address misinfo and disinfo, not foreign influence, but as it relates to the Canadian media ecosystem generally. How Canadians consume media makes them more vulnerable to some of the, and those consumption trends make them more vulnerable to some of the phenomena that you are studying. We know that more Canadians are getting their news online, specifically from social media, and that less are participating in a shared space and consuming information produced by organizations that have strong or identifiable journalistic standards, or standards of review, evidence, and context to begin with. And we also know that the effects of recent corporate decisions and policies can make the media ecosystem weaker. So for instance, Meta and Facebook, which is a source of news according to the Reuters digital study, 25% of Canadians get news from Facebook, 29% get it from YouTube. Well, the recent decision to throttle by Meta news on Facebook and Instagram means that in our study, 41% of respondents say that it has had a negative effect on their ability to stay current with the news. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your opening statements. We're going to do 2 rounds, 6 minutes to start with Mr. Caputo. Go ahead, Mr. Caputo, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bardizzi. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Great, thank you. And Professor Bradshaw, I appreciate you both being here. Now, Professor Bradshaw, you're currently, it sounds like a tenure-track professor in the U.S., is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Just out of curiosity, and this isn't bad or good or anything, I'm just wondering, have you lived in Canada or just stayed here during an election campaign or anything like that?
I have. Even though I live and work in the U.S., I'm actually Canadian, so.
Okay, perfect. Well, then that's good. So, so you'll be up to date, I'm sure, on a lot of Canadian political happenings. If you could name each of you, you all have your area of expertise, and sometimes we get very nuanced area of expertise, but I always like to ask this question. If you could change one thing that would inhibit misinformation, disinformation, you've talked a lot about social media, if you were responsible in this area for the Canadian government, what would you do first thing tomorrow? First, Professor Bradshaw.
Sure. I think I would be working around issues that have more to do with platform transparency. And I say this because I think, even especially with the Canadian context, we actually don't have a very good empirical understanding of how the activities that we see state actors engage in translate to changes in behavior, and particularly voting behavior. I think there are some real measurable consequences of these kinds of campaigns when they, for example, attack activists or female journalists, because there's clear kind of political suppression happening with very measurable consequences that appear in the literature. But getting somebody to change their mind or to alter their voting behavior, these kinds of things are very ingrained and embedded in our identities, and being able to actually get access to better data to study social media's immediate effect on those kinds of attitudinal changes over time, I think is really, really important to enhance a lot of the concerns raised by the field. We're starting to develop more empirics and evidence around this, but we need better access to data. And so that's where I would really start if I wanted to see changes. I unfortunately don't think that there is a silver bullet solution to mis and disinformation. There isn't something that we can immediately do to make this problem kind of go away, because it's kind of something that's really at the conflux of human behavior and like the real technical design of platforms that might incentivize certain kinds of information to go viral over others, which again is like also socially shaped by the people who are interacting with it. And so it's something that will need a lot more long-term attention to. So I think starting with the empirics and getting a better grounding and understanding of the causal mechanisms will be really, really important.
Sounds like we're looking at a 10 to 20 year project here based on the way you said it. And Mr. Bardisi, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I definitely endorse every single thing that Professor Bradshaw said, and to create that fact base for policymakers is really important. I will maybe answer with two quick points. One, a longer term project, but to have an olive system, education system response that brings in the media companies and those who are collectively responsible for creating a shared space for debate and factual presentation. And that, I believe, is a shared actually responsibility between educators and the media sector. And the second, I'll come back to, I think the passage of the Online Harms Act, Bill C-63, would have a positive effect on some of these phenomena.
One thing that I'm struck by as a parliamentarian, and I came in partway through this study, but you talk about deepfakes and I have my idea of what that is. One of the things that really gives me concern is just how easy it is to create such content, and secondarily, how easy it is to disseminate such content. Given those two factors, are we really in a situation where, rather than, as opposed to prevention, we're really looking at management?
I think yes, but I also think that in the context of, mis and disinformation and coordinated efforts to manipulate election processes, there's a much longer kill chain for, the technical kind of platform speak around an information operation. In order to get the deep fake on the platform and going viral, you have to be able to create a fake account. And in order to create the fake account, you have to deceive a lot of the internal systems within these platforms. And so I think even though there is an easier ability to kind of create and disseminate deep fake related content, if we're talking about it in the context of an information operation, we still need to consider the broader life cycle that these operations have to go through. And a lot of the mitigation measures have nothing really to do with the AI side of things. It still relies much more on, the old school kind of IP detection and all of the tricks that platforms play to figure out if this is a real person or a fake account.
Thank you, Professor Bradshaw, Mr. Caputo. We're going to go to Mr. Baines for 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for joining us today. I'm going to start with Ms. Bradshaw. If you could maybe talk a little bit about, you mentioned tropes and other methods, tactics employed by Russia specifically, and we've recently seen a rise in other hostile actors to manipulate Western voices. And then there's the use of, say, even domestic commentators who amplify these tropes. Can you maybe describe that a little bit, how it's being translated here, and then having domestic commentators amplifying these things, and then how we can maybe combat some of those things?
Yeah, definitely. So, in a lot of the more effective disinformation campaigns that I've studied, I think a lot of them aren't relying on false information, but instead they're drawing on harmful identity tropes. And they're using these ideas around racism, sexism, xenophobia to polarize society, to suppress certain kinds of people from participating, or even to incite violence against particular groups or individuals within societies. And I think when we're thinking about combating this kind of identity-based disinformation, it's really a tricky challenge because when you can't just slap a label on something that is sexist on the internet and you can't just simply like fact check racism away, it's very much a long-term human bias problem, and so it's going to take a long-term kind of strategy to manage that. But I think drawing attention to the fact that these are kind of the tactics and strategies of influence operations today is really important. I think platforms can do more, like particularly on the political violence side of things, and when we're going to more extreme and egregious cases. I'm thinking about like Myanmar and the coordinated campaigns against the Rohingya population by the government there, where we see like violence and even a genocide against a particular group of people. Having platforms do appropriate human rights assessments, making sure that they have enough content moderators who have local language understanding and local contextual understanding of any given society.
So you're
really
putting
important.
it back onto the platform providers to do a little bit more work as well. But like I met with the Canadian-Ukrainian Congress yesterday. They advocated for bans on Russian state-led media on the internet. Canada has banned certain media. It's also taken measures to look at other social media platforms, WeChat, and TikTok and others like that. So I'm wondering if bans are effective, and if you can maybe talk a little bit about that and getting into maybe I'll actually switch to Mr. Bardisi and maybe engage in the conversation as well. Maybe you can maybe shed some light on that. And why are these methods working?
Well, banning on broadcast channels is a bit easier than banning internet sites or online content. That's why we think at the dais the Online Harms Act, which doesn't look at so much specific platforms, but looks at this specific behavior and content, is the way to go. Coupled with some of that algorithmic transparency, coupled with some of that availability to have data that Professor Bradshaw mentioned. I'll also, I guess, bring a piece that we haven't really talked about yet, which this entire conversation exists in a context of trust or mistrust. And where there is a trusted messenger, that is where the misinfo or disinfo is more likely to land. And where there's a context of mistrust, then a messenger can fill that vacuum and generate trust. I think that's the main concern with some of these propaganda outfits. It's not that people around this table don't see them as propaganda. It's more that there are people who are perhaps have lower trust in some of the mainstream media institutions or some of the institutions of society more generally. In Canada, the Reuters Digital News Survey shows that trust in mainstream media and news overall has fallen 20 points over the last few years, 20 percentage points. So it's in that context that some of these actors can weaponize some of those platforms or associate themselves with ideas that are harmful to Canada. It's very difficult, both legislatively and in other ways, to actually ban platforms or sites in Canada. Countries have tried to do this, including some Western countries, and some in the global South with very large populations, and we've seen those bans. TikTok is banned in India. There was an attempt to ban X in Brazil. That itself is difficult enough to ban at the individual outlet level is very operationally difficult and may not be may not be meeting the interests of what we're trying to pursue here.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baines. En avant de commencer avec M. Villemur.
Before we move on with Mr. Villemur, I want to make sure that both witnesses are hearing English.
Good. Mr. Villemur, commence.
Mr. Villemur, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to both our witnesses for being with us today. Both of you shared a bit of a dark description of the current situation, and I'll ask the same question to both of you, and I'll start with Ms. Bradshaw. Often, there are states that want to create chaos or division, and disinformation can be one of the tools used by those in order to create chaos. Are we looking at the start of a cognitive war here? Ms. Bradshaw.
I don't know if it's necessarily a start. I think a lot of these strategies go back and have a very, very long history. A lot of, the current Russian playbook for information operations reflects a lot of the Cold War strategies of the past. And so I wouldn't say we're necessarily at the start, but we do need to think about responses that like Professor Bardisi highlighted, rebuild trust to kind of create that cognitive defense against these kinds of attacks.
D'accord. Avant de passer la parole à M. Bardisi, je vous dirais oui.
Before moving on to Mr. Bardisi, yes, we do need to examine trust. And trust means not having to prove anything, but fact checkers now are ensuring that we can have trust. And perhaps we're at the beginning of a cognitive war here, but Mr. Bardisi, these tools that create division and chaos, are they part of this? Perhaps, but it's up to us to decide how to act. As Professor Bradshaw stated, and as you stated, we need to see what society's trust levels are at, and if we could increase trust in institutions. As you know, it's a political tactic. It's not only a foreign one, it's also something that we have here to create chaos and mistrust. And so we need to decide on having a political debate but without fueling those agents, foreign agents that want to thrive on that chaos. So we need to have a debate here without bolstering the confidence of foreign actors that want to hurt us. All right, so in this debate, we need to weigh freedom of expression on one side and the public interest on the other. Where would you place the convergence of those two ideas? At DICE, we work on future leaders. And we want to have increased leadership in young people. You need to look at different information. And I'll respond in English for a moment.
For you to model the kind of political space that you want to be in. And so I believe from a public policy matter that these bills like the Online Harms Act and the Foreign Interference Projet de Loi, those form effective kind of guardrails, and that it's incumbent on leaders, not just political leaders, but leaders across society, to show the norms that have us have a good debate, but that don't let the foreign actors take confidence in creating more misinfo around the debate that we do have.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Il me reste combien de temps? J'ai pas noté.
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? 1 minute, 45 seconds, Mr. Villemur. Ms. Bradshaw, in that time, social media platforms have a financial interest in creating clicks. And we know what content creates more clicks. So we want freedom of expression, but how can we ensure that there is balance?
Yeah. And, I think this is really the $1 million question of the century, right? How do we create business models that are going to support democracy rather than ones that are going to incentivize hate and anger and fear and frustration? I don't have a good answer to that question, but I do want to acknowledge that these things are in tension. I do think that coming back to kind of the platform transparency angle, when we know that when we have insight into how platforms make the trade-offs between freedom of expression and other interests, we can kind of better evaluate how they are doing content moderation, whether that's good for democracy or not. Because the questions that they are tackling sometimes are very, very difficult questions and don't have a right or wrong answer. And so things and initiatives like the Facebook Oversight Board that's creating kind of a public record of very difficult cases to sort of set precedent for how these decisions are made, I think are really positive steps. And I'd want to see more transparency initiatives and more kind of efforts going into that kind of those kinds of applications.
Okay. Il faut voir aussi que l'intérêt public de l'un n'aligne pas toujours avec l'intérêt.
And one's interest does not necessarily align with somebody else's. Thank you, Monsieur Villemur.
You have 6 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome both subject matter experts. It's nice to have subject matter experts here today, but I do know that you bring with you your own unique political experiences. Mr. Bardesi, I do know you from your previous life, and I'm wondering, without putting you on the spot, if you're comfortable talking about your political experience in campaigns at all.
Sure. Yeah, I'm here as an expert witness, but I do have that background, both as a political staffer and more recently as a candidate in the provincial election 2022. And I'll say that I observed the in a very acute way, and perhaps this is familiar to other members, the third part of my remarks about the Canadian media ecosystem more generally. My campaign, like a lot of maybe local campaigns, just didn't get any local coverage.
I actually have more specificity, although I'm sure your local campaign was exhilarating. I want to go back to the Kathleen Wynne election. And from the outside looking in, the emergence of Ontario Proud under Jeff Ballingall, who we know to be a conservative staffer, somebody who has, created Canada Proud, is an owner in the post-millennial, and has been at the center of particular egregious examples of misinformation and disinformation. And I know that there was a fervor, second only to what I would see from this recent kind of iteration of the F. Trudeau culture that has been created on the far right. Can you speak to, from your experience, in whatever way you think appropriate to this discussion, ways in which you may have watched Ontario Proud use Facebook and other, although I think it was primarily Facebook, avenues to spread misinformation, disinformation, and I would say malinformation, if I could.
Yeah. So I was the Director of Policy and the Deputy Principal Secretary to the Premier of Ontario from 2011 to 2016. So I was there for the Premier Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, and I was the platform lead on the 2014 campaign. And at that time, frankly, these issues were not as pronounced. There was a media ecosystem there that was out there. There was online campaigning. People appeared to be getting information from a variety of sources, and mistrust and the toxic authoritarian populism that started to emerge in North America was not as apparent then. I will say, and this was primarily after I left the Premier's office, but I know that definitely Premier Wynne faced a certain amount of personally directed hate, as did caucus members, as did, in fact, people from a variety of political and partisan persuasions as elected officials. While I wasn't involved in the 28 campaign with some of the events that you described, We actually did do a study in 2019 as part of the Facebook ad transparency work that we were trying to bring. We allied with a researcher that was bringing disclosure on who was being targeted with Facebook ads, and that, along with a number that was called Who Targets Me, that's still a project that's underway with our collaborators over in the UK and Ireland. And so we did a study at that time, not focused on the provincial election, but then which prompted that and other efforts prompted pretty good Facebook political ad transparency registry that was created. And indeed, the entity that you described and a number of others with either generic names or names that weren't quite reflective of what they were actually promoting were some of the main buyers of online ads on Facebook in the 29 campaign. And I'll just leave it with the names of the organizations would not tell you with much specificity what they were actually about.
Well, I do know that there's a National Observer story that I think was in 2022 that linked phone numbers with people such as Angelo Isiduro, who Corporate Filings identified as a writer for the Post-Millennial, who made headlines when he resigned from Vancouver's NPA party after allegedly flashing a hand gesture associated with white extremism. I would say likely a Nazi salute. And he has, of course, through these findings, direct connections with Ballingal's company, Mobilize Media Group. And so if you could just talk a little bit about the way in which there is I would put it, threat of third-party advertisers, social media, and the ecosystem of misinformation and disinformation as it relates to electoral politics, particularly given the consideration that we've just seen an election in BC. We have them in the prairies. It's going to be coming to us federally. If you could just comment on that. I have about 45 seconds left.
Sure. I'll say this. There are a number of news outlets or outlets that appear to be news outlets that are primed and designed to appeal to a younger demographic. The Buffalo News was mentioned in the Huck Commission's initial report. There are a number of outlets that, and with the Meta, Facebook, and Instagram news ban, there are new ones that are popping up. SixBuzz is a popular one amongst my students in the Greater Toronto area. So I'll observe that there are a number of sites that don't have the kind of editorial controls that you would expect, that masquerade or that appear to be news sites or that have an agenda that are reaching larger audiences.
Okay. Ms. Bradshaw, I will come to you with that same question in my next round. It looks like I've run out of time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. That does conclude our first round. We're going to do 5, 2.5, 2.5, and then we're going to conclude the meeting. We're going to start with Mr. Barrett for 5. Go ahead, sir.
So I'd like to refer to an ABC News article dated October 18, 2023. It says, U.S. says initial independent review shows no evidence of bomb strike on Gaza hospital. I want to read the first paragraph of this article. A day after the Hamas-led Gaza Health Ministry claimed Israel had attacked the Al-Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza City, saying some 500 Palestinians had been killed, Israeli and U.S. officials, explosive experts, and President Joe Biden said Wednesday, and available evidence shows the destruction was caused instead by a failed Palestinian terrorist rocket launch. I'm going to end the quote from that story there, but I would then like to refer to a tweet from 10/7/2023, and it's by Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, posted on X, and it says, quote, bombing a hospital is an unthinkable act, and there's no doubt that doing so is absolutely illegal. Now, that was viewed 2.7 million times, and I want to draw to your attention the context that existed at the time, and that goes back to this ABC article's opening graph that talks about that initial claim. And that initial claim was that Israel had perpetrated an attack on a civilian site, killing 500 civilians, innocents, in that war. And that was reported by mainstream news outlets across the West, including here in Canada. And many, if not all, issued some form of correction. But the tweet that I read to you from Canada's foreign minister I just read that and wrote it down in the last 5 minutes. So that tweet is still up, viewed 2.7 million times. How harmful is this? It's frankly, it's recklessness from a government-verified account. Now, on the platform X, there's different types of verifications, and one of them is from a government official or an elected official. This has the gray check mark. Talk about the disruption that foreign or hostile state actors they seek to create. And it's not necessarily to favor one political ideology or another. And I think, Professor Bradshaw, you talked about during a very contentious time in 2020 in the U.S., BLM riots, and the same hostile states were sponsoring or fomenting both supporters of BLM, but also supporters of Blue Lives Matter. So trying to create discord between two groups in a very tense situation, a tense time. So this example here, do you believe that this type of failure to act after a hot take, which can happen on social media, do you believe that it enables hostile foreign states to create the kind of division that frankly we've seen in Canada in the face of this ongoing war in the Middle East? I'll start with you, Professor Bradshaw.
Yeah, so I don't remember the fact check story or anything like that. So I'm going to focus my response mainly on the role that I think influencers can play in the dissemination of mis and disinformation when we're looking at things like COVID misinformation, for example. It's really a small number of people who tend to generate the most engagement around like the conspiracy theories, and thinking about the role of people who have large audiences on social media. There's almost a greater incentive or a greater reason to, with great power comes great responsibility, kind of take more steps to ensure that fair and accurate and good information is going out to audiences. But platforms in particular have not traditionally taken that path. There have been a lot of, whistleblower documents that have shown specific kind of whitelists of accounts from people who are influencers who have large followings and can kind of get past a lot of the moderation systems because it generates engagement. And so for me, I think the problem is really there. And we should not be so worried about a Russian Twitter account that's not generating as much engagement and not reaching like mainstream public attention. But we should also be thinking more broadly about the role of influencers. And I also think that's why we see a lot of Russian information operations pivoting to hiring and co-opting local voices and people who already have audiences. If we're thinking about policy responses too, like generating that kind of trust and building a culture for influencers to do some defending of democracy could be a potential like positive route. But you also don't want to be paying them and do that kind of stuff. But you know what I mean.
Thank you. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Bardizzi, we didn't have time to go to you. Mr. Housefather, you have 5 minutes on this round.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the witnesses for being here. Professor Bradshaw, I read your paper about the 2020 election that you co-wrote with some others. And one of the things that struck me was the way that different platforms, you looked in particular at X and at Facebook, dealt with disinformation related to the election. Could you sort of just walk us through the issue where 30% of the posts were not treated, consistently by the platforms, and why that was?
Yeah, so this was a paper that used a really interesting data set of misinformation narratives that we had identified and reported to the platforms, and then we assessed whether or not they took action or did not take action against the content that was reported to them, and sort of checked by researchers to see, like, is this a misinformation narrative or not? And one of the things that explained the differences, some of them were really simple, like technical fixes. For example, if we had reported a narrative, things that were on a certain date, things that were published before weren't necessarily like backdated with a label, but things going forward were. We also noticed differences across the different kinds of media. And if things were like screen grabbed or like cut or edited slightly, the automated detection tools didn't always do a great job at identifying similar kind of misinformation narratives, because you have to remember a lot of this kind of content takedown is done automatically by automated systems. And so there was like a couple of problems there. But, you know, for the most part, we saw about 70% of the content being enforced, and a lot of the decisions to not enforce were relatively arbitrary based on these kind of small, like technical problems or problems with the automated systems that I think could easily be fixed.
The allegation that there were pre-filled ballots, and when you had a picture of the pre-filled ballot, you would then have the content noted as being misinformation, but you wouldn't necessarily if they put up a video saying this. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, it really depended on like the particular narratives that we were looking at. I don't remember if that was an exact example, but that is kind of a good characterization of like some of the differences we were seeing.
They put together the election integrity, type of approach from the different social media companies in 2020. When we're looking at the upcoming Canadian election, what lessons should we learn that the Americans did right in 2020, or that the social media companies did well as they applied it to the 2020 election, and what did they do wrong?
Yeah, so in terms of really great lessons, you know, I think a lot of the partnerships with academic institutions was a real success. Like, it led us to be able to not only detect and brief the public real time on misinformation narratives that were occurring, but allowed us to do really interesting and novel research on the back end to sort of audit platform content moderation, something that's really, really difficult to do. In terms of things that could be done better, I think there was so much public and far right outlash against those kinds of initiatives, and universities didn't do well at necessarily protecting the researchers and the groups who were doing this really important work. And I don't think the platforms really did a lot to kind of protect those partnerships, and they're taking a step back from doing those kinds of collaborations now. And so I think that was a real harm, and something that, you know, we could protect and create a more positive multi-stakeholder culture around.
Do you have any time, Mr. Chair? 30 seconds. Oh. I'll pass that on to my Bloc and NDP colleague if one of them wants to take it. Thanks.
I actually may take that time.
Okay,
at the end,
fine.
So,
then I'll pass it on to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Monsieur Villemure, 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
2.5 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Housefather. Mr. Bardisi, you shared your expertise earlier, and you stated that C63 and C70 are great measures to counter disinformation and foreign interference, but in both cases, one has not been adopted and one has not been implemented. In under 12 months, there will be an election in Canada. What can be done, considering these measures might not yet be in place? Professor Bradshaw mentioned partnerships between companies and researchers. Those don't depend on bills. And so companies can work with researchers in order to share information on their algorithms, and share information to help researchers. And that would allow researchers to advise the public. That's what's currently happening. And you might think it's misinformation, but it's not. It's important to work with institutions outside of government and social media that are trustworthy or can be seen as trustworthy by people. Secondly, members of parliament who are seeking to be re-elected must say to their constituents that the media that we have here that are in your cities are not the enemy. It's important as leaders of your communities to state that media outlets who work with standards that are working for everyone are valid even though they're not working for you. Thank you, Mr. Bardisi. In Trois-Rivières, we have a lot of media outlets, but since Facebook banned news, they've been struggling. And we've had a lot of media and few journalists. And so the information might not be as reliable or might not be seen as trustworthy by Canadians. Mr. Chair, I can see you, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
See, Monsieur Villemure.
Thank you, Mr. Villemure. Mr. Green.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bradshaw, you had probably listened into my exchange there. I know that you're Canadian, so you have context to this. My friend, Mr. Villemure, talked about kind of cognitive warfare. Steve Bannon, in fact, a chief far-right extremist strategist with connections to Canada's far-right extremist movement, talked about cognitive warfare. In essence, flooding the zone with a word that I can't say because it's unparliamentary. Could you comment on the ecosystem of third-party political actors, fake news, quite literally these fake online platforms that pop up? You can probably list, there's probably a dozen of them that I can think of off of 10. And then the online platforms that actually look like news. You talked about the Buffalo News, there's the Western Standard, there's a whole bunch of these far-right extreme outlets. How do average people sift through all of that stuff in an electoral cycle in order to make informed decisions based on the facts?
Yeah, certainly. So first, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the disinformation for hire kind of groups and how there is an industry kind of backing a lot of disinformation campaigns, which reminds us that we should not only focus on political and cognitive warfare, but recognize that a lot of these actors are incentivized. So not just platforms, but the creators of disinformation are incentivized to do so because they can generate advertising revenue or business deals with governments. And so thinking about policy responses could also think about raising the costs to engage in these kinds of activities by making them less profitable, taking, the typical kind of scam and fraud approaches and applying it to disinformation and these groups that try to generate advertising revenue by creating fake news stories and getting people to visit websites that show them ads. Like this is all kind of part of the broader ecosystem of challenges. And so when it comes to what citizens should do to navigate this complicated environment, I do think that we don't always give citizens enough credit for the diversity of media that they already consume. We don't just get our news from social media. It does play an increasingly important role, but so do our what we read in newspapers, what we watch on TV, who our social circles are, and who's kind of immediately around us in our community. All of these things play really important roles in terms of shaping our political knowledge and then therefore our behaviors. And so when we're thinking about solutions, like we can focus and home in on the social media angle, but we can also think about building more robust social institutions to empower people through different other kinds of media to have that diverse knowledge and to be able to generate their own kind of political knowledge and opinions.
Thank you. I definitely ran out of time. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you.
Chair. I know you were generous.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. En avant de poser ma question.
Before I ask my question, apologies, Mr. Bardizzi, you speak French very well.
I do have a question. None of this has been touched today, but we have heard from prior witnesses about the impact that artificial intelligence is going to have on the propagation of disinformation and misinformation. So I'm going to give you both an opportunity in a minute or less to share your thoughts with the committee on that. And I'll start with you, Mr. Bardizzi, if you don't mind.
Sure. So AI, Kevin Kelly, who's this internet kind of guru back in the day, says the internet is fundamentally a giant copying machine. And AI has the ability to create, copies of things at incredible speed and at incredibly low cost, and incredible volume. I'm specifically concerned, actually, with AI-generated content on audio versus visual content. I think there's some evidence that audio content is harder to discern as being a deepfake. So that's one thing to be aware of, that as we prepare people around this issue, that we have a specific kind of line of inquiry about audio-related deep fake content. I also, though, commend to this group, Bruce Shiner, Harvard Kennedy School researcher, has this great little article, 16 ways that AI can be kind of useful or interesting for democracy. It's not all bad. There may be some specific uses around the edges of AI that could help us and help you do your jobs.
Okay.
But definitely area of concern.
Thank you. Ms. Bradshaw.
Yeah, +1 to everything Professor Bardizzi has said. For me, I think the greatest challenge with AI is the way that we talk about it in the public and in the media, because coming back to the idea of trust, when we're constantly telling people that they can't trust anything they see, read, or hear, we're not creating resilient citizens who are able to then effectively participate in society. And so I think being able to create digital literacy programs that generate, that don't build too much kind of like just overt skepticism, and that kind of like need to not trust anything that we read, see, or hear anymore, I think is really, really important going forward, because we do need some level of trust. So all in there.
Yeah. Interesting, because one of the things we have heard is exactly what you've talked about: critical thinking, digital literacy. And Finland has been used as the model for education in grade school. And I suspect, and I can't preclude any conclusions or recommendations of this committee, but that may be a big part of what we provide in terms of a recommendation going forward. So I want to thank you both for being here today. And I do invite you, if you have any afterthoughts, to submit them to the clerk, because oftentimes, as I said earlier, you walk away, you're sitting there in bed at night, I should have said this. Well, I'm giving you that opportunity. If you could provide that to the committee by 5 o'clock on Friday, that would be helpful. We like to have deadlines at this committee. Just for the sake of committee members, before I conclude, I just want to let you know that Thursday we have TikTok, Google, Meta, and X coming for this study, so prepare your questions, and that's it for today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to our technicians, clerk, analysts, and our witnesses. The meeting is adjourned.